The Godzilla films feature surprisingly emotional deaths, from Mothra's tragic fall to Dr. Serizawa's selfless sacrifice. What may be surprising is how moving many of these are. Some even becoming too bleak for some viewers. Tragic deaths in Godzilla movies come in many forms. More often than not, it is the kaiju themselves who meet their fate throughout their frantic battles, and it is possible to draw compassion from even Godzilla's most evil and menacing opponents. Of course, the many collateral human deaths that occur in the wake of the monster's activities can make for even more poignant moments. In this video we list 10 of the saddest deaths seen in the Godzilla movies. 10. Godzilla in the Volcano. Throughout the many confusing iterations of Godzilla's timeline, the king of the monsters himself has died and returned many times. While audiences can be assured that one version or another of Godzilla will return to movie screens, the death of one specific incarnation of the king of the monsters was particularly heartbreaking. The 1984 film was a reboot and sequel to the original film. The Return of Godzilla, like its 1954 predecessor, is one of the few Godzilla films to clearly show Godzilla as an antagonist, a destructive force of nature that must be destroyed by humanity. Still, there is something tragic about the death of the great beast, trapped helplessly in the rubble of an active volcano as it moans in anguish. Even if this death is technically a happy ending, it's hard not to feel a certain sense of remorse when Godzilla dies in such a horrible way. 9. Godzilla eliminates Mothra. Mothra is the only recurring kaiju in the Godzilla series that has a history almost as legendary as that of the king of the monsters himself. He appeared in his own solo film before crossing paths with Godzilla. Mothra has died and been resurrected on several occasions and is practically a phoenix who always comes back to life in one way or another. In their first confrontation, Mothra was unable to defeat Godzilla, being burned to death by her rival's atomic breath during the battle. With her last breath, she manages to imbue her life force into an egg, from which twin Mothra larvae hatch and manage to end the fight. Even though she is reincarnated soon after with her offspring, it is heartbreaking that Mothra perishes under Godzilla's atomic breath when she was only trying to protect humanity. 8. The death of Dr. Serizawa. The Monsterverse's drive. Serizawa wasn't the only character with that name to sacrifice himself for the greater good, and the idea was one of many scenes the Monsterverse borrowed from previous Godzilla films. While the Monsterverse's drive. Serizawa is an expert on Godzilla. In the original film, he was the scientist responsible for creating the deadly oxygen destroyer, a powerful weapon capable of taking down Godzilla. After the device is successfully used against the creature, drive, Serizawa burns his notes, ensuring that no one else can replicate the oxygen destroyer for use against humans. Unfortunately, Serizawa is smart enough to recognize that his own mind still contains the weapon's secrets. After telling protagonists Ogata and Emiko to be happy together, Serizawa suffocates to death after dropping the last working model in the middle of the ocean, ensuring that the secret of creating the oxygen destroyer dies with him. 7. Kiryu's sacrifice. The Millennium era of Godzilla showed us self-contained films that had no apparent continuity. In Godzilla Tokyo SOS, the kaiju faced off against another incarnation of Mechagodzilla, a powerful cyborg built around the bones of the original 1954 Godzilla named Kiryu. Even though the original Godzilla's latent consciousness lies within the bones of his body, Kiryu still chooses to sacrifice himself for the team and save all of humanity. Another film in which Godzilla is more or less firmly the villain, Godzilla Tokyo SOS, features Kiryu as a sort of tragic hero who confronts Godzilla in the depths of the ocean, using his thrusters to ensure that they are both buried beneath an underwater trench. Before doing so, he ensures that his pilot, Yoshito, can escape, proving that Kiryu is a friend to humanity even after the spirit of the original Godzilla has taken control. This perhaps suggests that the original Godzilla has some regret for the 1954 massacre. 6. The death of Shindo. It's rare for Godzilla to recognize humans individually, much less feel bad about killing them. However, that precise scenario occurs in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, exploring the emotional side of the franchise with humans and monsters. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah was one of the many reboots the Godzilla series went through, retelling the Kaiju's origin story as a simple dinosaur that was awakened again by nuclear testing. Shindo, a cunning and opportunistic businessman, who helped in the process that turned Godzillasaurus into Godzilla to stop King Ghidorah. A representation of human greed, Shindo harbored nuclear devices behind the Japanese government's back and, of course, deserved what was happening to him. However, during his rampage in Tokyo, Godzilla appears to recognize Shindo and hesitates, before Shindo gives him a brief nod, accepting the consequences of his actions. It's a fascinating dynamic between humans and monsters that hasn't been recreated in any Godzilla film since, although it's a little difficult to understand. 5. The Sacrifice of Dr. Serizawa. Like the original film, the Monsterverse features a prominent character known as Dr. Serizawa. Instead of creating the oxygen destroyer, this drive, Serizawa serves as Monarch's expert on Godzilla, closely following the creature throughout its life. When Godzilla is nearly defeated by King Ghidorah and needs a high dose of artificial radiation to become strong enough to confront the alien invader before it destroys all of human civilization, someone must volunteer to manually detonate a nuclear device strong enough to wake him up. Serizawa volunteers for the position, and decides to sacrifice himself to give Godzilla, whom he considers an old friend, a chance to fight King Ghidorah. The touching moment where Godzilla recognizes Serizawa and grants him the rare honor of voluntarily petting the Titan's enormous snout is one of the most moving scenes in the entire Monsterverse. Few human deaths in the series are as bittersweet to watch as Serizawa's final goodbye to Godzilla before succumbing to lethal amounts of radiation. 4. The Death of Godzilla. Of all the Godzilla films ever made, the original 1954 classic most firmly establishes the titular Kaiju as a villain and a threat to humanity, from beginning to end. That said, there's still something incredibly poignant about his death in the movie that started it all. While the moment when Godzilla dies should feel like a moment of triumph, the final scene ends up playing out like an empty victory, with Godzilla's death being both relieving and tragic. The oxygen destroyer is one of the most sinister weapons ever developed, and its insidious, unnatural method of killing is evident from its first test on some fish. It's important to remember that Godzilla is as much a victim of nuclear testing as the rest of humanity, lashing out at civilization out of confusion and fear as much as revenge. The eerie feeling of watching Godzilla breathe his last after the device's activation perhaps explains why the oxygen destroyer was only used once. 3. Mothras Sacrifice. The Monsterverse films have slowly begun to reintroduce classic elements from Toho's most iconic films, and Mothra's death is certainly one of them. In Godzilla, King of the Monsters, Mothra is introduced as Godzilla's historical ally, joining him in the fight against the dangerous invasive species that is King Ghidorah. Unfortunately, Rodan seriously wounds her in battle and ends up sacrificing herself to grant Godzilla her life force so he can defeat the three-headed dragon. This death is a little sadder than Mothra's other deaths for being such a voluntary sacrifice. Mothra knows that she is not strong enough to defeat King Ghidorah alone, or even help Godzilla in any meaningful way by fighting alongside him. Instead, he chooses to die so Godzilla can have a fighting chance, deliberately giving his life force to his old friend. 2. Rodan Sacrifice. Mothra wasn't the only flying kaiju who had to sacrifice her life for Godzilla to win. Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 sees Godzilla take on the second incarnation of Mechagodzilla, by far one of the deadliest weapons built by humans. The Global Defense Force discovers Godzilla's second secret brain and attacks him with a devastating electric harpoon, seemingly close to killing the king of the monsters once and for all. But just when Godzilla appears to have died, Rodan appears and offers his fiery life force to restore Godzilla's energy. This ruthless sacrifice is a truly bittersweet moment in the franchise, as it brings back one iconic monster at the expense of another. Still, this would be far from Rodan's last appearance in a Godzilla film. 1. Junior's death. Godzilla's offspring, affectionately referred to as Baby Godzilla in the English dub of his debut film, was a controversial introduction to the Godzilla films of the Heisei era. However, Godzilla's son became endearing as the films progressed, making it even more heartbreaking when he finally dies in Godzilla vs. Destoroyah in 1995. While the baby Godzillasaurus manages to take on a weaker form of Destoroyah, the beast's final enhanced appearance quickly finishes him off. After ascending to his perfect form, Destoroyah drops Godzilla's son, now known as Godzilla Jr., from a great height before shooting him with his micro-oxygen beam. Junior's death so soon after reuniting with his father is incredibly sad, and the brutality with which Destoroyah kills him easily makes him one of Godzilla's most detestable villains. Godzilla's futile attempts to resurrect his dead son only make the death harder. Even if Godzilla Jr. wasn't especially popular, he didn't deserve such a tragic fate. The Godzilla movies continue to advance and each time seek to bring us new and better interactions of the King of the Monsters. Who knows, perhaps in the future we will see an even more tragic death than the ones we mention in this video. Tell us what other emblematic deaths you know of. This is the Zilla channel and we'll see you in the next video.